Everyone, we left off on page 112. She walked into the lounge slowly. Sarah noticed her and came over instantly. The question was written all over her face, but Kerry wasn't prepared to answer it yet. Quigley was outside, and he's come to stay with Aiden and Patrick, she said with false cheer as she put Quigley down. The little beagle ran over to the kids, and they dropped to their knees to greet him. Kerry turned to Sarah. "We need to talk outside." "Mummy!" Aiden yelled and ran over, leaving Quigley with Patrick. Patrick tried to grab his brother to stop him, but he wasn't fast enough. Quigley, naturally, followed Aiden since the boy was running, and therefore Patrick was forced to follow. "Mummy, where's Daddy?" Aiden asked, looking up. He could tell Patrick was worried, and his mummy looked worried too. Kerry attempted to smile, but sorely failed. Looking at Patrick's worried expression was almost as bad as Aiden's innocent one. "Daddy had to take a trip," Kerry said. "When will he be back?" Patrick asked warily. "I don't know yet. It was an emergency, so it could be a few days. Meanwhile, you're going to stay here. So I brought Quigley to keep you company. Sarah will be here with you until she has to go, and when she does, I'll get someone else to stay here with you." "Can you stay with us?" Aiden asked, "and tell us stories about cases?" "I'm sorry, buddy. I have to go work. It's very important." Patrick put his hand on Aiden's shoulder. He had figured out that something was wrong with Dad, but he had no clue what. And he could tell his mom was worried. "Come on, Aiden. We're going to miss the last 10 minutes of the show. Quigley, heel." Quigley obeyed, and Patrick guided Aiden and the dog over to the television. Kerry looked at Patrick with a mixture of admiration and sympathy. The poor kid shouldn't have to handle this without ever knowing what he was handling. But she couldn't tell them, not till she knew something. Kerry led the way out of the lounge, and Sarah followed. As soon as the door shut, Kerry began briefing Sarah on what they had found. She held up the evidence bag. "I need to process this. Greg's still interviewing my neighbors to see if they saw anything. The next-door neighbor, Mrs. Brown, she's usually home during the day, so she might have seen something. Everyone else works. It's unlikely they were there." Sarah nodded. "Can I do anything, Kerry?" she asked. "Stay with Aiden and Patrick until you're needed for forensics," she answered. "And as soon as you are needed, make sure someone's with them other than the guards at the door." "Okay," Sarah said. "I'd offer my apartment to you and your family tonight, but I only have one bedroom, and the family room would get kind of crowded. I mean, unless you can't find another place to stay." "Of course, it's fine," Kerry said with a smile. Sarah seemed nervous. The young CSI nodded and said, "I'm going to get back in there with them. Do they need to do their homework or anything?" "Yeah, go ahead and tell them to do it. It'll seem more like a normal day if they do their homework. When they're finished, they can keep watching television. Patrick has a music player in his backpack. You can plug it into the television and they'll listen to classical music while they work." Sarah nodded and smiled. "Okay, consider it done. Do you want me to ride them to school tomorrow, or—" "I don't think they'll go to school tomorrow," Kerry said. "I want them here at the station, just in case." Sarah completely understood Kerry's reasoning. "Okay," she said. "All right, I'll go process this. Thanks, Sarah." "Think nothing of it," Sarah said dismissively, and entered back into the lounge. Kerry headed straight for the fingerprint lab, knowing she could process the evidence off the phone and then take it to trace and DNA. Connor certainly wasn't in any condition to throw the phone out the window, she thought, so his captors might have smudged their fingerprints on the phone or gotten some trace on it. She put her lab coat on, sterilized her hands and put gloves on, and opened the evidence bag, extracting the phone. She flipped open the phone and saw the words, "2 missed calls," appear on the holographic screen. She stared at the words for a moment before she placed the phone in the laser ablation box, which promptly cleaned all traces off the phone and stored the contents in the computer. Kerry took the phone out and then scrolled through the list of trace the machine picked up. Other than blood, she didn't see anything possible to test for human DNA, but she did see animal saliva listed. That instantly went in the test category, and she had the machine retrieve it from its storage and deposit it directly into the DNA testing device. Would it help to know what animal had carried off the phone? No, not really, but she was going to be as thorough as she could be and get the entire story. The teeth marks were small and just broke the outer plastic on the phone. And now that the phone was clean, it was ready to be tested for fingerprints. She sprinkled latent print powder on it to reveal invisible fingerprints, and then ran it through the scanner, which scanned all visible and invisible fingerprints directly into the database and began searching. While the database worked, she took the phone out of the scanner and saved her results on the computer. Then, instead of watching the icon spin while she waited, she looked down at the phone. It did have quite a lot of fingerprints on it. Connor was forever on the phone, though. In addition to writing, he traded stocks and handled the family's finances, which amounted to a lot of mobile video conversations. The results came back, interrupting her thoughts. She looked at the screen and came up with several sets of prints. Connor's were there, of course. Then hers. Those were invisible and were fairly old. And then there was a third set of fingerprints. They belonged to someone on file named Joe Lorenz. She saved the search and began a new search for all information concerning Lorenz, including choice results. She looked up as the analysis of the trace contents came up on the screen. DNA confirmed that the animal was a raccoon, and that the dirt had no extra compounds in it except for some fertilizer, probably from runoff from the embankment along the highway. There was no gunshot residue, though the blood she had already swabbed was now being analyzed in the computer, and she awaited anxiously for the results. The computer finished fairly quickly and came up with the DNA results. Connor Sean O'Malley. It was what she had been expecting, but somehow, it still felt like a knife in her side. Kerry waited for the computer to find all the information it could on Lorenz, and stared at the phone again. She noticed for the first time that Connor had set up a banner at the top of his screen. "Captain on the bridge," it said, every time one flipped the phone open. Below the banner was the message, "2 missed calls," once again. Now that the blood had been analyzed, and the search saved, she needed to seal the phone in an evidence process bag and file it away. But she hated to part with anything of Connor's right now. What if her optimism was to no avail, and his cell phone was one of the last bits of him that remained? "Kerry, you're being ridiculous," she scolded herself. "Get a hold of yourself. You aren't thinking straight. This is evidence. It's given you a fingerprint, one that might find Connor for you. Put the phone in the evidence process bag and leave it for the trial." She listened to reason, and placed the phone in the evidence process bag where it was automatically vacuum sealed in place. She then sealed the bag's opening where one released the vacuum seal, and it with a piece of red tape and initialed it. If anyone got into the bag, they would have to break her seal. She didn't even realize that she was staring at the phone through the bag until the door opened suddenly behind her. Kerry turned quickly to find Justin standing there. "How are you doing?" he asked gently, approaching her slowly. "Just processing the phone," Kerry said. "Got anything?" "Fingerprints. A man named Joe Lorenz left some of his fingerprints when he threw it out of the car. The blood on the phone is Connor's, and a raccoon carried it from the embankment into the woods." Justin nodded. "We found a lot of fingerprints at the scene as well. They're being processed right now. I ran the DNA. The blood was Connor's." She nodded, closing her eyes briefly before looking up. "The hair as well?" "On the painting frame? Yes." "Any other DNA?" "No, but we did find a few trace elements. They're being scanned. Fibers from someone's shirt, probably scraped off of Lorenz or his accomplice during the fight." "Okay," Kerry said with a nod. "The boys are in the lounge with Sarah. Is Greg done interviewing?" "The neighbors didn't see anything," Justin told her. "I'm sorry. It would have been helpful, but now they know what's going on at least." "Greg didn't disclose anything except what he had to. Do you want us to call anyone?" "Not right now," Kerry said simply, and there was a pause. "Thank you, though." He nodded. "We checked the outside of the house. There was blood on the driveway." "And I didn't notice that?" Kerry thought to herself before she asked, "Did you check for the wheelbase of the car?" "They didn't skid when they left. They probably didn't leave very quickly. If Connor was unconscious, they wanted to attract as little attention as they could, and he wouldn't have been putting up a fight to stop them from driving away slowly," Justin said. "They didn't brush up against the curb?" "No," he told her. "I'm sorry. We tested the blood on the driveway, though. It's Connor's as well." Kerry nodded slowly. "Aerial imagery," she said finally. "We need to zoom in on my house and see if we can get a license plate number." Justin nodded once. "I'm on it," he said as he turned to leave. "If you need anything, Kerry, a place to stay tonight? I've got a few extra rooms in my house. Carol won't mind." "That would be great," she said with a smile. It'd be better for my kids if I didn't have to explain why we were going to a hotel. At least we can pretend this is a social call." "You'll need to tell them something," he said, looking concerned. "I told them Connor's on an emergency trip. Patrick knows I was lying. Aiden accepted that explanation, but I don't think he will for long. They're smart little boys. I know. I just don't want to tell them anything until I know something more. If we find him within the next 24 hours or so, they won't need an explanation. They'll need an explanation as to why he's in the hospital, Kerry. Gunshot wounds need treatment, and they're going to want to see him, Justin said softly. Kerry looked down at her vacuum-sealed evidence bag and stared at it as she said quietly, I know. Go get me those aerial images, Justin. He frowned, but nodded and left. Kerry either wasn't ready to acknowledge the fact that Connor was seriously injured, or simply didn't want to talk about it. He suspected the latter, since she never was one for personal discussion. Information on Lorenz popped up on Kerry's screen, and she diverted her attention to that. Lorenz had been to prison on account of at least a dozen robberies. Breaking and entering was something he was accustomed to, which accounted for his entrance into her house. Connor always locked the door, and she warned him to put the alarm on, but he obviously hadn't been complying. She read through Lorenz's history, his years in jail, and suspected contacts through those years. He was on their list for suspected Diablo members. Lorenz had only missed his last choice test, since he had to go because he was on probation up until last year. That would give them some information. She started pulling up the choices he had taken. He had decided to buy a new car, apply for a job at Benito's restaurant down on Locust Street in Chicago's North Side. He'd also taken classes in archery, completed 40 hours of community service, and sent regular messages back to his parole officer up until just last year. He passed for the perfect, cured ex-criminal, just what the Diablo looked for in a recruit. His record showed that he had gone on vacation to Switzerland last July, and that he had met with a man in California for no reason apparent to his parole officer last August. The Chicago PD had observed him contacting some suspected Diablo members. She was about to send these records to Justin, Nikki, Sarah, and Greg's computers when the door opened behind her. She turned around again, expecting to see Justin, but instead she saw Agent Anderson. I heard what happened, Lieutenant, he said as the door closed behind him. Have you got anything on Tejada? She asked him, unwilling to talk about this right now. He nodded. The Bureau is following up on a couple of leads. We've taken anti-terrorist measures around Chicago as well. The terror alert's elevated. Good, she said. This was followed by an uncomfortable silence, until finally Anderson asked, Can I do anything for you, or for your family? Just find Tejada and concentrate on national security. Anderson nodded. It was obvious that Kerry didn't want to talk about her husband right now. Okay, that's what I'll do. I sent your results on the bombs into the Chicago field office. They're double-checking on their end, and they're building jamming devices as we speak. Let me know if there's anything else I can do. Kerry nodded as he left. She had almost completely forgotten about her discovery of the frequency the bomb could operate on, and the construction of the jamming device. She stood up and went to go check on everyone's progress processing her crime scene, and find one of her CSIs who was free to go with her to investigate Benito's restaurant. First, she filed away the cell phone, and then she closed out of the computers. As she exited the lab, she couldn't help but drift her thoughts to what Connor must be feeling and seeing at the moment. Walking down the hallway, she saw the waiting room, where victims' families were waiting in apprehension for one of her CSIs or a detective to come and speak to them about their findings. Kerry forced herself to stop thinking about Connor in the context of her husband, and only think of him as a victim. That was harder than it seemed, though. Every other moment, the image of blood pool in the study flashed in her mind, and the thought of him being shot was almost unbearable. Concentrate, Kerry, she told herself. Concentrate. We'll read more tomorrow.